Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So we are going to kickstart this session, which we're going to be talking about some lessons on public policy in terms of supporting entrepreneurship ecosystems in both Portugal and Brazil. Let me start first by saying a huge thank you to GEN for inviting me. My name, for those who didn't look on my bio on the app, is Helena Martins, and I'm originally Brazilian. I've been working at Google for 15 years. I started based in Brazil on the public policy team, and then I moved to Portugal, actually, to lead public policy for Google there. And now I'm doing something else entirely, focused on AI, still on the public policy team. But because of the experience that I had in Portugal, I thought this was a great opportunity to share some of the lessons that I learned in these past years, watching Portugal become an extreme hot spot for startups and entrepreneurship. I don't know, Felipe, if you want to introduce yourself first.
Sure. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, boa tarde. It's great to be here, and I also want to thank Jen for inviting me and having us in this panel. My name is Felipe Matos. I have been working with tech entrepreneurship in Brazil for the past 25 years in all the possible hats that you can imagine. I've been an entrepreneur myself, an angel investor, VC manager, a public policy manager, and also a researcher. So I've done a bunch of things, different things regarding startups and tech entrepreneurship, and I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. So we thought before we dive into looking specifically on the public policies that have supported both the Portuguese and the Brazilian startup ecosystem, that we kind of like establish what's the understanding of startups. And I will read what's the definition of startups that has been recently established by the Portuguese government in a recent legislation that they passed to support the startups. So basically for Portugal, startups are companies that must have been in business for less than 10 years, have fewer than 250 employees, and have a turnover of less than 15 million euros. And for Brazil?
Well, for Brazil, we just had the Startup Act approved a couple of years ago, and a startup for the Brazilian legislation is a company that is less than 10 years old. It has to have income of less than $3 million yearly, roughly, and it must put on their contract that they are an innovative company, whatever it means, that they have to say, to state in their incorporation documents that they are an innovative company.
Actually, that's
company.
That's a very good reminder, because that's also a requirement on the Portuguese legislation, and I'm very curious to see how that will be applied in practice. What does that mean? But well, I wanted to ask the audience if anyone has heard about Portugal becoming a hotspot for entrepreneurs and startups. Has anyone heard about this? You have heard about it? You too? Okay, so let me give you some historical background. Some years ago, this huge tech event called Web Summit, which was originally based in Dublin, opened up a call in Europe to have a new city be the host for this tech conference. Web Summit is a conference that hosts around 70,000 people per year. It gathers startups, it gathers venture capitals, it gathers tech companies, the whole ecosystem. So it was a huge opportunity for any city to actually become the host of this event. And right off the bat, Portugal saw, because of the strong tourism sector that Portugal has, saw as an opportunity to pitch and have this event come to Lisbon. They succeeded. Obviously, they committed to investing as well in infrastructure and other things, but also directly to the conference in itself. But the thing that was very interesting from a public policy standpoint is that Portugal didn't only stop there. Okay, now we have this huge event and we stop there. That's enough to make our economy grow, so forth and so on. But they didn't stop there. They actually, in the same year that Web Summit decided to come to Portugal, they created a very strong and solid program called the Startup Portugal that has several different activities and initiatives within it. One of them, and I would say the most significant one from my perspective, is that they've created a one-stop shop that helps the startups understand not only the legal framework and all the legislation, but also basically how to open a company in Portugal and find, for instance, investment, so forth and so on, and connect with the wider startup ecosystem. In addition to that, this program, Startup Portugal, which is partly funded by the government, but it's actually an association. They also have stuff such as vouchers for startups. They have a program that supports, for instance, they supported the creation of, how do I call that? It's a board of entrepreneurs. They gathered 30 of the most influential business people, business leaders in Portugal to get together and discuss what needs to be done for Portugal to continue to support in a healthy way the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And this has led, this board and all of the work done by Startup Portugal has led to the creation of a startup law, which was the one that I referred in the beginning of my talk. Basically, they were able to approve in a very short time this startup law that helps and gives tax benefits to startups, the ones that apply for they are within the scope of what a startup is defined. And not only that, it also helps, for instance, with visas, which is something very attractive. That has been one of the, I would say, biggest selling points for Portugal to become this hub. As you know, and I'm sure you've heard, Portugal has 300 sunny days per year. It's quite cheap. So the only real obstacle for people to move there is to get a visa. So in this way, the Portuguese government decided that if you classify as a startup or if you classify as an investor, you are entitled to get a visa. This has led to, I would say, parallel challenges in the housing ecosystem, but this is a topic for another conversation. Not so good ones. But at the end of the day, just for you to have an idea, Portugal has 7 unicorns right now. That's a higher rate per capita, let's say, than Spain, than Germany, than France, than UK. So they have been quite successful in this approach of both from a legislative standpoint, creating this framework, but also making it easier for talent to get visa and access to the country. I was also going to mention that locally, Lisbon has been very active too. They created a unicorn factory, which is a startup hub. It's a combination of an incubator, accelerator, many things happen there. And they're extremely active, and a lot of startups around Europe decide to move to Portugal because of this extremely successful program run by the city of Lisbon. And yeah, there are other things. I will stop right, because I could continue talking about other stuff, and I'll go back to it, but I also want to give you, Felipe, the chance to talk about Brazil a little bit.
Yeah, I was listening to you, and I envy Portugal a little bit, because some of the things that they have done, especially the tax incentives for startups and investors, it's something that really would benefit a lot in Brazil if we had it. We don't. So to give you a perspective in terms of legislation and policies for startups in Brazil, I I was head of the first public program to support startups in Brazil nationwide. That was back in 2013, Startup Brazil. Um, and after I left, the government, well, many learnings on how the government works and everything else. And I decided to start working with policy advocacy because I understood, and with a group of other leaders in the ecosystem, that really needed some changes in the legislation for startups. One of my colleagues in this endeavor is right here, Maria Rita. And we started advocating for a startup act, and 5 years later we got it approved. It was a mix of feelings. We were happy because we got it approved after all, and Brazil has a startup act and has a definition of startup and lots of policies supporting startups. But we also got very frustrated because the pain points that we wanted to have been solved were not included in the final text of that law. So especially when it comes to taxation and to investment support, angel investment support, most specifically, we haven't got the benefits and the changes in legislations that we wanted to. But the good news is that we have a Startup Act, and one thing that was really interesting that it did was to create a new way for governments to purchase innovation from startups. So before that law, the Brazilian government will have to go through a very complicated process of inquiring the purchase and the whole system. It'll be almost impossible for a startup to sell something to the government. And now it's way more easier. There's this act which is a public call for innovation. And startups may apply with their solutions, and the government can test different solutions and purchase and keep buying the ones that work best. This is something really new. Before that, the government would have to specify very specifically what is the object they are buying, basically. And now they can say, I have this problem, I have this challenge, and I'm looking for a solution. I don't know what that solution might be. And then startups would apply to that public call with whatever solution they are supposed to offer. And then the government is able to try out new different things and innovations, and the startups are able to sell to the government, basically. And one last thing before I pass back to you. I think that one of the most interesting government initiatives in Brazil for entrepreneurship in terms of legislation and public policies is what the central bank has been doing for the past couple of years. So the Brazilian central bank is considered to be one of the most innovative in the world. They have been really pushing the legislation forward and creating space for startups to come and create new fintechs and new financial solutions, which is quite interesting. Usually the startups would come first and push the government to change legislation. In Brazil, the central bank is moving fast with that, and they created lots of different regulations to support fintechs. They created a society of credit, which is basically a startup can start lending money, being a startup with way less capital than a bank would need. And we have lots of credit fintechs right now in Brazil. And well, sandboxes and many other initiatives that I can talk better later on.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned fintechs and the central bank, because there has been also a surge of fintechs coming to Portugal for the exact opposite reason, which is a lack of legislation, specifically for fintechs, because Europe, this is a highly regulated sector, the financial sector. It's a highly regulated sector in Europe, and for some reason, Portugal doesn't have heavy, let's say, or burdensome legislative framework for fintech. So there's been a surge. Now there is some discussion about creating specific legislation for the sector, but it's still being discussed. The thing that I was also going to mention, that because of COVID, during European countries received this recovery fund, and you had to determine how you were going to use this recovery fund. And a big chunk of the recovery fund that came to Portugal was assigned to entrepreneurship, innovation, and technology research and development. And with that, they created some sandboxes. They created some regulatory sandboxes, what they called free tech zones. That would be maybe my translation to that, where basically it's a easier environment to test new products, so forth and so on. And that has been quite successful as well in attracting startups, or maybe also incentivizing Portuguese to create their own startups. And I was also going to say that I'm talking about, and we've been focusing a lot about things that are directly connected to the startup ecosystem in making the environment friendly for this environment, for this ecosystem to thrive. But I think it's also important to look at some other structural points. Portugal is one of the countries in Europe with the best internet infrastructure. Broadband is really all around. So that makes it very easy for a company to come and establish themselves, especially if they need good internet. So this is something that, although obviously Portugal didn't invest in the infrastructure thinking of that, but obviously that helps a lot. And in addition to that, I would also say that the cost of living, as I said, is very low. And the talent in Portugal, STEM, engineering talent is incredible. So obviously, if you have some of these elements, it just makes it very easy, plus all the regulatory support that I mentioned previously for startups to want to come. I think there are still many challenges in Portugal for startups. And one of them is around internationalization. The country is very small, so for a startup to only focus on the Portuguese market, it's not very interesting. At the same time, being based in Europe poses its challenges to kind of reach markets outside of Europe. So this is one thing, hold this thought, because I'll go back to that in a bit. In addition to that, European countries in general, I wouldn't say that this is just the case of Portugal, have very complicated labor laws, and obviously this also applies to startups. And even though they try to address some of the concerns coming from the ecosystem in the startup law, there's still a lot that can be done in that area. And I know that there is a lot of discussion now, and this being the big focus, the big legislative focus in the coming months. Just to say as well that I heard in a panel earlier on how some of these initiatives are really tied to the electoral cycles, unfortunately. And right now, Portugal just had elections. We have a new government since May. And we still haven't heard really what's the long-term strategy of this new government for the ecosystem. So obviously, I'm telling you that there are things on the pipeline, but this is based on the people that are working on the ecosystem, not necessarily part of the agenda of the government. And having said that, I would just make a final comment going back to my initial remark on the challenges of internationalization. One of the things that have been noticed as a pattern in Portugal, I would say also other countries in Europe, that despite the support that they get, there's still difficult access to investment. And the regulatory framework, and I'm not talking now about the Portuguese regulatory framework, I'm talking about the European regulatory framework. It's extremely complicated. I'm gonna ask my technician, I don't know if he's looking at me. ¿Puedes poner el slide que te había pedido? I don't know if you can see. I'm trying to move. But these are all the laws in Europe that apply to digital services. So even though you might be based in a country like Portugal, where you have a very friendly regulatory framework, you still have to deal with all of this. And that is not super attractive. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of a startup that was created by a Portuguese woman named Daniela Braga. She created an AI startup called Define.ai, basically providing services on ethical data. And they had to move to the US because it was just too complicated to continue operating in Europe. So I think this also adds to the challenge of, at least for Portugal right now, in how to retain, not only to create, to have these startups coming there and grow up and become scale-ups, but when they become scale-ups and unicorns, so forth and so on, how they can convince them to stay in the country and not immigrate.
Yeah, well, when it comes to Brazil, I would say that we have a pretty big internal market, and it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. The blessing because, well, it's big, so there's space for a lot of new startups to be born, to thrive, to grow, to even become unicorns, only attending the internal market of Brazil. But it's a curse because most Brazilian entrepreneurs do not think about expanding their businesses outside of Brazil. So we almost don't have many good examples of internationalization of startups. I wanted to jump to talk a little bit more on the fintech side that I have mentioned earlier. I have here some initiatives from both the central bank, from the CVM, which is the Security Commissions of Brazil, and from SUSEP, which is the entity that regulates insurance. All of them have done different initiatives for startups. So the central bank, the list goes on, but basically they've created a new framework for startups to become financial institutions. So before that, if you wanted to, like, let's say, open a bank, you would need at least $300 million and a lot of regulations to comply with. But now, with basically just $1 million, you can have a credit entity as a startup. So that really improved a lot the local ecosystem and created a space for many fintechs to come. The same thing with credit and payments. Brazil has also created the open banking strategy, which is basically freeing your banking data. So this idea is that your banking data belongs to you, not to your bank or to any financial institution. So you can migrate your data to other institutions, and then you can get better services. If I'm a startup and I have access to your historical bank data, I can give you better credit options, credit loans, insurance, and many other financial services. So this is changing a lot the landscape for fintechs in Brazil. There was also Pix, which is an instant payment solution that was actually held by the central bank, and all the financial institutions must comply with and connect with the network of Pix. So you can basically send and receive digital payments instantly, 24/7. And this has also brought some innovation to startups which are using Pix and integrated to their workflows and systems to innovate. When it comes to equity crowdfunding, we have our SEC, CVM. They have regulated and improved the regulation over and over to have equity crowdfunding that basically allows investors, micro angel investors, to invest via online crowdfunding platforms on startups, and nowadays it's getting less restrictive as it was. So the first version of the regulation was very strict, and now they are expanding it over and over, which I think is great news. And finally, the insurance regulatory entities that created a sandbox to basically allow innovative insurance startups to be created with like insurances by hour, micro insurances that are tied to digital transactions, like you take an Uber, and that is secured, that ride, for instance. These things are being developed because of that regulatory sandbox as well. So when it comes to fintechs, there's a lot going on in Brazil.
I mean, going back to the point previously that I made with regards to fintechs, I think Brazil seems to be way ahead of Portugal in that regard, because one of the things that Startup Portugal has on the list of their priorities for this next term is really to seek banks to support more the startup, because one of the problems that Portugal has is access to investment. Basically, it's one of the biggest challenges that startups face when they go to Portugal, because most of the venture capitals are not based there. So they're trying to rally up banks, investment funds, pensions, to start investing more. And with what they're trying to create is a system where it will be a little bit less risky for the banks and for the pension funds to invest in startups, where the government would take part of that risk in case something doesn't work as intended or the investment doesn't come back. So this is something that, looking in the future, that Startup Portugal is really trying to change. And also going back to what I said before with regards to labor laws, one of the things that they are trying to change is that, well, Portugal has, for a single employee, one of the highest tax regimes. They have to pay, I don't know, 37% of taxes per employee. It's quite high. And when we are talking about the level of payment that some of these talents want to receive, obviously that is quite prohibitive. So this is also something that for the next term they are trying to change, which is to make labor laws a little bit more friendly for startups. In addition to that, there is a very interesting discussion in facilitating access to startups for public procurement. I don't know if this is something that has happened in Brazil, but a lot of the startups in Portugal, they're actually business-to-business startups, and they want to be able to sell to governments, but because they don't fit all the criteria that the government usually requires for a supplier to meet, they are not able to join some of these public procurements. So this is something also that they have been working on to try to adjust.
Yeah, this is exactly something that Brazil has improved with the Startup Act, as I mentioned before, creating this mechanism for public procurement. So basically the government can buy from startups in a much easier way compared than before. But I wanted to talk about some things that we're still missing. So in Brazil, we don't have a startup visa yet. We don't have any kind of tax incentives for both startups and angel investors, and this is something that I have been pushing a lot for the past few years. I see Maria Rita that we've worked a lot on this issue, and it's something that we really wanted to change. And in terms of regulations that are being discussed right now, we have the tax regime reform, which is changing the whole way taxation works in Brazil. We really need that. Brazil has the most complex tax system in the world, and well, it's a mess. If you are an entrepreneur, you have to deal with hundreds, maybe thousands of different rules to comply with when it comes to taxation. So Now that we're going through a tax reform, we're trying to make sure that the complexity will change, and we should look for some kind of benefit or for startups. Basically nowadays, if you're a startup, you're paying the same taxes as larger companies, which is basically not competitive. And when it comes to labor laws, there's a discussion going on the gig economy workers. So in transportation app drivers, delivery guys. The labor law in Brazil is also very complex, and it protects a lot the worker. And when it comes to, so a company would have to pay, you said 37% in Portugal, it's almost 90%, 90, in Brazil. So it's way expensive, it's very prohibitive for startups to hire people. And when this gig economy came in, the workers are not employees of the Ubers and the apps, but they're basically micro entrepreneurs. But there's a gap. There's a legislative gap, and a lot have been discussed lately to create a labor regime that lies in between the regular one and nothing, or the business one. They are micro entrepreneurs, to basically allow them to have some basic rights like insurance if they get sick, or pension as well. And finally, but not least, the AI regulations. So there's a lot going on, and I'm sure this is very interesting to you as a Google worker. There has been some discussions on AI. The current proposal to regulate AI in Brazil, it's a project of law with, I don't know, 150 and 180 pages. It's huge. And it says, basically, it's very protective of the data and the privacy rights, and not really friendly for startups or big techs. When it comes to AI, I don't think we're going in a good way with that present law project, but I hope we continue and have something better in place.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because you remember the table that I showed you with all those legislations that apply to the digital sector, right? So for a company like Google, which is where I work, obviously we have the resources to comply with them. For a startup, that's very complicated. And because Europe has the ambition of becoming this innovation hub, they need to really look at this and think about what to do with all of this. As I mentioned before, there's so many startups and examples of startups that leave Europe because it's just too complicated to operate, too risky to operate. You don't want to get a fine from a regulatory agency. And right now, there is work being done by the European Commission to evaluate specifically this. They are focusing trying to ensure that Europe remains competitive in the world of AI, obviously. And one of the things that they're looking at is specifically this regulatory framework. I was going to say, just because you mentioned the AI law, that it's always tricky, it's always hard to strike the balance of creating a legislation that will protect consumers, will protect users, and promoting innovation. This is a real challenge. It's really difficult. There is no silver bullet when we talk about legislation for innovation, and that applies to technology. I think a really good rule of thumb, and that I usually like to share when we are discussing about regulation for the tech sector, is that we should always look at what the technology is being used for and have a risk-based approach. Because most often, and when it comes to AI specifically, there's so much fear, there's a lot of myth, there's a lot of lack of understanding of the technology, that sometimes we are driven by the fears, but not necessarily the real world applications of these technologies. And I think this is usually a good way to approach. I believe, from my personal perspective, that Europe has done a good job with the AI Act, which is the legislation that has just been approved. Actually, I think it's about to be published now in August, hasn't been published yet. Portugal has been in the forefront of these discussions and super supportive of the act. But the discussions were a bit, I would say, tilted to a maybe less risk-based approach when ChatGPT came to life. And all of a sudden, a discussion that has been going on, because the AI Act discussion has been going on for at least 5 years, but all of a sudden it was dominated by generative AI, because as you know, AI has been among us for a long time. It's not ChatGPT that brought AI to our lives. Google Maps, when you're trying to find the fastest route, that's AI working for you. So it's not something new, but obviously ChatGPT brought a new type of interaction with AI that we didn't have experience with. And that also brings new challenges. But in that regard, the European Union decided to go a little bit of a different route. There are many discussions on what that will mean for innovation in the continent, because the US, for instance, and Japan and some other countries are taking a different approach. The UK is taking a different approach, which is to create regulatory frameworks, not laws, which means that they have different kind of enforcement characteristics, let's say. So it's very intriguing to see, and I'm very curious to see how this will affect the entrepreneurship and all of these efforts that governments are making to ensure that startups are, that they have a healthy ecosystem for startups, when there are many things in parallel happening that might negatively impact that. And I just wanted to finalize and say, Felipe and I, we were discussing about this panel a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that we said was it's very common in the rhetoric for governments to be like, we are pro-innovation, we want startups to come, but when it comes to really putting the work and looking at the public policies that exist, looking at the law that exists, and doing the work to change and adapt those to make really the country a friendly country for startups, those not always go hand in hand. So this is something also to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think from my personal perspective, I think that the AI should be regulated not directly, but the consequences or the applications of AI in specific markets, on specific applications. You go there and you legislate there.
Like, for instance, if you're using AI for health, you legislate within the health sector or so forth and so on. That's what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. Because otherwise, you can create a very heavy layer of legislation that would prevent innovation to come.
I agree with you. I think we have 13 minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions, comments, thoughts, reflections.
Okay.
Yes. I think she has a microphone for you.
Yes, he has a question.
Hi.
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 So I love this last comment that you were talking about to do with how we ensure that we're not countering all the other things that legislators are seeking to do. And I have a question for you about, is the answer to that, which is what we've assumed so far, to ask entrepreneurs and founders themselves to explain why their efforts to regulate AI would cause a barrier? Because our biggest experience is when we talk to the legislators and the policymakers, they don't really understand what they're doing. In fact, they really don't understand the technology. You know, they use this term AI or deep tech, and actually they're not really talking about AI. So part of the thing is you're never really going to educate an elected official to the level that they need to be educated to understand that they're dampening startup activity. So is that one of the ways to do it, and is that possible to do it by taking the approach you mentioned, so that you have the healthcare industry people doing it more in the context of healthcare, rather than the privacy people doing a one-size-fits-all with AI? So my question is really, how do we address that? Because I think we'd all agree we don't want to stifle innovative activity by startups. But we understand there's got to be some protections in place. Is it by helping put the startups themselves directly in front of the policymakers?
Maybe I can start and then. First of all, I love your question. I think that's usually on the top of my mind all the time when I'm discussing AI and trying to have these conversations with policymakers and trying to show what are of course, that there is a need to mitigate the risks, but also we need to do so in a way that we don't stifle innovation, as you very well said. There is a very interesting case, which is France, because France has always had quite of a conservative approach when it comes to tech regulation. And because they have very big, well, growing now, startups on AI, their approach to the AI Act was quite different, because the startups were very well connected to the government and explaining how approach A or approach B could affect them. So I completely agree with you that that's something that in an ideal world should happen. I think the challenge is, and it's something also that Felipe and I discussed, is that startups usually have very little resources to engage in those conversations, right? Portugal, for instance, doesn't have a civil startup association because there is lack of resources. And this is the case for many countries. It's hard for startups to organize themselves and take the little resources that they already have to go and advocate for policies that will support, even for policies that will support them. You know what I mean? So I think it's a challenge, at least from a Google perspective. What we try to do, because we have strong connections with the startup ecosystem, is that whenever we see there is something that could affect them negatively, we try to engage with them and actually facilitate the way that they can reach to policymakers. Because it's also hard from a startup perspective to understand what is being discussed from a legislative standpoint. So that translation sometimes is also something very important that needs to take place, because there are no lawyers working for startups most often. They don't have a public policy person to tell them what's happening, how that could affect their business. So I think it's something that requires really horizontal effort, both from big tech, that we have the resources and we are engaging in these conversations all the time. I do believe that policymakers can also seek actively the opinions of startups. But I also agree with the point that you made, that depending on the sector, it would be interesting also to have those sectors involved. And this is something that also happened in the AI Act, specifically with the automobiles, with vehicles sector. They've been very engaged in the discussions, which has been quite helpful.
Yeah, to give a perspective of what's happening in Brazil when it comes to that, the current project of law is really, really heavy on the startups. Basically, I would say that the level of understanding of the technology by the government and the politicians is really, really low. And there are a lot of fears, a lot of prejudice, a lot of myths when it comes to AI. And some of the demands that the project of law has is, for instance, to let users audit the code of an AI to understand what it's doing with your data, which is basically impossible because of the nature of AI algorithms. They are basically not you don't program them, you train them. And they find a way to come up with a solution, so it's basically not auditable.
This is a very 2020 discussion, it seems to me. In Europe, at least, we passed that at least, because I remember there were some efforts with regards to that, and people finally understood that from a technological standpoint that was not possible. So we have passed that at least.
Exactly, we're not there yet. So I think that still we'll need a lot of talks and dialogue with the government and with the legislators to come up with a better solution. And as I said, what I think would be the best model is to legislate specifically about the aspects of the outcomes of the use of the AI for specific sectors or niches or applications. So let's say deep fakes using generative AI. We have to regulate that, but not like the whole AI technology in itself, which would be crazy.
More questions. I think we have one there, and then we come to you.
In there, yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Alma Diaz. I work for Puerto Rico Community Foundation. And I don't know if you already have this information, but in Puerto Rico, we have what we call the single business portal. Every entrepreneur has to have a profile, and depending where you live, sometimes there are big municipalities that have less requirements because they are big, they are fast at their process, but the other ones and the other municipalities have a long process. From the philanthropy side, I always ask myself how I can facilitate permissology or advice or mentorship to my entrepreneurs that are having these challenges with the single business portal. What can nonprofits do? And even though we are not legislators and we are always impacting policy, but what we can do to understanding the challenges that our entrepreneurs have, and if there's something that we group together, for example, in Puerto Rico, I'm sure if we establish a plan or a group that can present to the government, there's a real problem with permissology, what will be the first step to take?
I'll take that one. Well, I would say the reality of Puerto Rico is really different than Brazil. I mean, we have 220 million inhabitants. The country is huge inside, is bigger than many European countries. So to have like all the entrepreneurs with a profile online seems like a dream to me. We don't have anything like that, so you're in a good start. What I have to say, though, is as vice president at the Brazilian Association of Startups, we've run one of the largest programs of mentorship in the country. We have over 1,000 mentors registered, and we match basically mentors and startups to help them get mentored and have the best possible fit between mentored company and mentor. And we use basically a software to do that and to manage it all. So technology can help you out, I would say.
I mean, I don't have much else to add. I think through your networks, I believe, you can actually create a very strong mentorship program. Because at the end of the day, you also don't have all the resources needed to support all the needs of the entrepreneurs having these difficulties. So I guess if you focus on connecting your networks, maybe that's something that would help. I don't know. And now here.
For the recording.
Oh, right, sorry. In Portugal and Brazil, what is, if I'm a startup, what is the typical route that the government's wanting me to go through? Is it the universities for support? Is it a public body, or is it the private sector? How are things set up in the respective countries?
I think in Portugal there are many different ways. I would say that the government clearly supports the one-stop shop approach, which is the one that I mentioned via Startup Portugal. it's a combination of things because they have their own incubator accelerator programs. They also have a network of other incubator accelerators that they support. So once you reach out to them, they kind of guide you through these programs, again, supported by the government in one way or the other. And then obviously there are private initiatives, there are other companies that operate in parallel. But that's I would say, if you would ask the government, that would be their advice. Go to Startup Portugal and and reach out to them to understand what are the options out there, and they will guide you through that.
Well, in Brazil, there's no specific route. I mean, the country's too big, and as I was mentioning before, because of that, we don't think a lot on foreign companies, not helping Brazilian startups to expand or facilitating for foreign companies to come in. There are a few initiatives like Apex Brazil, which is the agency of exports, promotion, and investment attraction, has a program called Scale Up in Brazil, which helps foreign startups to come and soft land in Brazil. But I would say there's no specific route in that term. There are many programs, usually private or by semi-private or semi-public institutions like SEBRAE and local governments as well. And many programs held by corporations and companies that support startups willing to enter the market as well. So you have to understand your niche and start networking within that niche in Brazil, and you find probably some good paths.
I don't know if we have more questions. Yes.
Thank you. Very quickly, I would like you both to comment on laws and regulations that can help us to improve diversity and impact in our ecosystem. We have something in Brazil like an impact or like CVM is doing, but I would love Felipe to say that and you to comment on Europe, what we have, if we have something, because if we don't change that, we increase diversity and we look to all startups to see the impact that they have. From my point of view, we are not going anywhere.
I really appreciate the question. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that because I was looking before the session on the 2024-2025 plan of Startup Portugal. And one of their goals is to increase diversity within startup CEOs and founders. How they're going to do, they don't explain that very well, to be honest, how they're going to support that. And I think that's usually the challenge, right? Again, it goes back to what I said before on the rhetoric. I think the rhetoric is that everyone wants more diversity and everyone supports that goal. But at the end of the day, what's the real implementation of that, what that looks like in concrete terms? Not always, I think, that happens. Let me share with you that from a Google perspective, we have several programs that support women founders. But again, this is from a private perspective, right?
And black founders as
well.
And
black founders as well.
Google has a great fund in Brazil just for black founders.
Yeah, that also exists in Europe, by the way. But again, this is a private company promoting these values and these perspectives and this view. I yet to see something very tangible and concrete coming from the government, although it's written there as a priority.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have too much to add. I would say when it comes to what's said in the discourse, we all support and promote diversity, but really when it comes to public legislation and regulations, I haven't seen anything really tangible to tackle that issue. We made a study specifically on policies that support diversity into the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Brazil, and it was really, really hard to find good initiatives. We found one here and there, usually local initiatives, very small, and we have a long way to go, I think. I would mention, not quite for startups, but the new regulation of CVM when it comes to boards, corporate boards of companies. Now they have to have at least a certain number of women members, which I think is a great idea. But still, there's a long way to go.
Okay, do we have more questions? I don't think so. Okay, I think we are at time. I also see like them telling us to stop. Thank you so much for coming and listening to us. I hope it was useful.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And we see you around. Bye.